Thank you very much. Some of my earliest memories are about my granddad talking about Siberia, or Siberia, as he always called it. He never lost his Polish accent. When I was a few years older than this, we would go for walks around his village or down to the sea, and as well as teaching me some basic Polish, he would also tell me about his experiences. He was always very happy and open to talking about what happened to him, different to other people I know who didn't like to talk about it. I think he maybe found it quite cathartic. My grandfather, Stan, or Stanisław, was born in the southeast of Poland. He lived on a small farm. The village was called Obręczówka. The nearest city was Tarnopol, and it was about an hour or two away by horse and cart. His family didn't have a lot. They grew some crops, barley, rye, wheat, and so on. They had a few animals. They had some birds, a couple of cows, a couple of pigs, a couple of horses. His father had got the land for half price because he'd fought in the Polish army against the Soviets in 1920. His father had another job, digging wells for some of the other farmers, a side hustle, you would call it nowadays, and my grandfather would help him out. School doesn't seem to have been regularly frequented. It seems to have been kind of optional. The Soviets invaded in September 1939, and my grandfather was 15 years old when he and his family were taken away from their home. Banging on the door by Soviet soldiers in the middle of the night, midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., a story that will be sadly familiar to all of you. They were put on a sled at gunpoint. They were taken to the local train station and were put on a train. Not a regular passenger train, but a cattle wagon. No seats, no warmth, no toilet, just wooden floors and whatever belongings they'd been able to gather quickly and take with them. They were told that they would be taken to another village in Poland, but it was a lie. They were taken to Siberia. Amongst all the stories about World War II, this story of the Polish deportees remains not that well known. We can only hypothesize why. The Soviets were our allies during the war. Perhaps it was an uncomfortable truth. But the numbers don't lie. More than 1 million Poles were deported. And that's why organizations like this and events like this are so important, to remember what happened. And it's about more than just remembering. As part of writing my book and publicizing the book, I often have to post on social media. And it's apparent that as well as people's lack of awareness of what happened, there also appear to be people out there who want to deny or rewrite what happened. I sometimes get comments about the Poles being to blame, the Poles starting the war, the Russians giving them freedom. So again, that's why these events and these organizations are so important. It's not just about history, it's also about the present and about the future. It goes without saying that Siberia was horrible. Everyone who is there has their story to tell. The freezing temperatures, the suffering, the disease, the lack of food, the illness, the death. My granddad said that the Soviets cared if an animal died, but not if a person died, as a person could be more easily replaced. Well, we're all waiting for our lunch here. I just wanted to read what my grandfather said about the food in Siberia. We were paid in food, bread and potato soup. Every day there was the same food, and the soup was more like water than soup. The food was rationed. All the work that we did was piecework, so that the amount of food you got depended on the amount of work that you did. But we were always hungry. We never got paid as much as the Russians who were also working there, and the NKVD secret police got the best rations, like meat and sugar. For a full 12-hour day of hard manual work, we would only get about a kilo of brown Russian bread. Sometimes we tried to cheat. One of us would stand at the front of the line and get the family's ration of bread. Another one of us would wait in the middle of the line and then ask for the bread again when they got to the front. Sometimes the baker couldn't remember if he had served that family already or not. My mother and younger brother and sister got even less food. "You're not doing any work for us," the guard said, "so why should you eat?" They got a daily ration of just a couple 100 grams of bread and a bowl of watery soup. I used to dream about my mother's food back in Poland, like the cakes that she used to make, or about kielbasa or bigos or swanina. My clothes were baggy and getting worn out and ragged. I could see my body getting thinner, and I could start to see more bones sticking out of my body. I felt tired all the time and had a cough. 15 years old, was old enough to go and work in Siberia, so he was sent out 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. First felling trees and then working in a blacksmith's. Every day thinner, weaker. His mother and his younger brother succumbed, and they died there. It was hard to dig their graves in the frozen ground. I was fortunate that my grandfather had an incredible memory for what happened to him. He remembered the names of the Russian towns beside the camp where he was, Noshul and Murashey. And you can look them up in Google Maps. And if you put it on a satellite view, you can see the landscape of snow and trees and rivers where they labored. Things must have seemed so hopeless for them. The Germans were taking over Europe, the Soviet Union was taking over the Baltic states, Britain had been pushed back, America was not yet in the war. They might have spent the rest of their lives in the Gulag. But the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 gave them some hope. Suddenly, the Poles were allowed to leave the camps. My granddad, aged 17, joined them, going to look for the Polish army, the Anders army, although he didn't know where it was. That would be the start of his remarkable journey halfway around the world. He was in his 80s when we decided to write down his story into a book. As I got older, I increasingly realized what a remarkable story it was. And as he got older too, we knew that we didn't want to lose that story. He had had many people approach him already wanting to write down his story from newspapers and so on, but he'd always turned them down and said no. I think he wanted a family member to write his story. So I'd drive over every weekend to his house near St Andrews in Scotland, and we'd spend a few hours going through his story. He'd be out in the garden when I arrived, or with his pigeons. He was very good at racing pigeons. They had lots of trophies and medals and certificates around the house. And he was really good at gardening too. He used to grow lots of potatoes and carrots and cabbage and all sorts. Of course, I get stuffed full of food every time I went over by both my grandparents. I think food was always really important to my grandfather because of the lack of food and privations that he had growing up. If I was ever picky about eating something when I was growing up, I would get the slightly tongue-in-cheek but also serious response, if you're in Siberia, you'd eat all of that up. You'd eat it and ask for more. After leaving the Gulag, he started the journey with his older brother across Russia and down through Kazakhstan. But he got separated from his brother in Kazakhstan and he was left alone, then aged 17. He ended up traveling thousands of kilometers on his own down through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, eventually arriving in the city of Tashkent. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees in Tashkent. They said the city was so swollen that it was like a leech that had sucked up too much blood. He slept on ashes at night to stay warm, or he worked on cotton farms. He got so desperate that one day he killed and ate a dog. With winter approaching, hope seemed lost. But close to giving up, he eventually found the Polish army close to a town in Uzbekistan. The army faked his age, as he was too young to officially join. And they took him down across the Caspian Sea, down to Persia, and down to Iraq. And he was based in a town called Habaniya in Iraq, which is about 100 miles or so away from Baghdad. This is the oldest photo we have of him. He would have been about 17 or 18 in this photograph. You can look it up, and that really was the name of it. It was a transit camp, and soldiers would be based there, waiting for their ship to take them back to the UK. They might stay there for weeks or months. It'd be very hot, there'd be lots of mosquitoes, and they'd go a little bit crazy. So that's where the slang term for crazy comes from, Dulali, the name for that camp. When his ship arrived in the UK, he was taken up to Fife in Scotland. And there he joined the first Polish Independent Parachute Brigade. And the brigade was based around the small towns on the coast in Fife. When you look up the Polish Parachute Brigade, there are only 9 companies listed, but Grandad was adamant he was in the 10th company. And there's a rumour that the 10th company was for paratroopers with disciplinary problems. He'd got in trouble for not saluting an officer and for refusing to be Batman to one of the captains. The goal of the Polish paratroopers had been to liberate Poland. They expected to be dropped into Poland during the war, perhaps into Warsaw to help with the uprising. But as the war continued, it became increasingly clear that that wasn't going to be possible. So instead, they were dropped in Western Europe at Arnhem in Operation Market Garden. You may have heard something about the Battle of Arnhem. You might have seen some films like A Bridge Too Far. It was designed to shorten the war. The plan was to seize key bridges over the River Rhine before the Germans could destroy them, and that would then allow the Allied forces to more quickly get into Germany. But it didn't go well. The German defences were much stronger than expected, and the casualty rate was huge. About a quarter of the Polish paratroopers were lost. Eventually, the order came through to retreat, but there weren't enough boats to get everyone back across the river, and my granddad was trapped behind German lines on the wrong side. The Dutch underground had to help him. One of them gave him a photo of the music band that he was in. They used to go around the local cafes playing folk music. And they helped him escape from the Germans. They dressed him up in civilian Dutch clothes, and they gave him a bicycle, and they said, right, we're just going to cycle past the SS guards. We'll speak Dutch to you, you don't say anything in reply. And that's exactly what they did. As if it wasn't nerve-wracking enough, the chain came off my granddad's bike beside the Nazis, and he had to get off and fix his chain. He was then hidden by the Dutch underground for about a month, in their houses or in the forest. They really risked their own necks to protect him. Every few days he'd be moved to try and keep him safe. One day, what he had been fearing happened. Some Nazis came into the house where he was hiding. He'd been up in the attic, and he heard them outside in the garden, then coming into the house, then coming up the stairs. He only had a few moments to try to find somewhere to hide. He looked around himself. He found an old, long winter coat. He threw it over a pram, and he hid underneath, just in time. They came into the room so close to him that he could see their feet from under the bottom of the coat. One of the original ideas that I had for the title of the book was The Man Who Dodged Death, and I think that really sums up his experiences. So I had all these notes from my discussions with Grandad, and it was quite daunting to sit down at a blank computer screen to try to turn it into a book. I actually first tried writing it back in 2007, but I found it very hard and I didn't really have the time to do it properly. So it was only when the COVID pandemic started that I found myself with enough time to try writing it again. I worked on the book every spare moment that I had, in the evening, at nights, at the weekends. It really takes over your life. But writing is only half the work. You also have to find a publisher. And eventually I was lucky. I got in touch directly with a publisher called Pen and Sword, and they specialize in history and military history. And they said they were interested and would like to publish the book. After the war, my granddad settled in Scotland. He met my grandma, a local girl, at one of the dances, Scottish country dancing that they used to have in the local town halls. Granddad, wearing his big army boots, had apparently sounded like a horse when he was dancing around. He would work on the local farm and for the local authority, and he had 2 children and 3 grandchildren. I just want to finish by saying some words from my grandfather again. Maybe it will resonate with you or with some people in your family. As for me, I could never entirely forget what had happened to me during the war. How could I? I don't think that anybody would forget such events, especially when so young. Even after the war, there was a constant, numbing reminder that I would never really be able to see my family in Poland again. But by then, I had a new family, and so I focused all my energy on supporting and raising them. And I successfully built a new and happy life in Scotland. At the end of the war, I had my whole life ahead of me. But that, as they say, is another story. Thank you very much.